when it happens, it doesn't matter that it's happened to everybody. It's when you see your parents go, it's primal. And so while I was living it, I promise you I wasn't taking notes or thinking of writing a book. It wasn't on my mind. For me, years later, it's when there are things that I can't forget and things that I wish I had done differently and things that I want to revisit, this ache. And so I'm writing from either an ache or a moment of such profound hilarity and absurdity, you know?
This is Phantom Hampton. Phantom Hampton is the podcast with stories from where the rest of us live. This episode is Last Words.
Oh, those are big blue eyes. Hypnotized every time I look at you. Hey, then you seem to thrill me through and through. You better do.
Today, I'm talking with friend and author Bob Morris about his new book, Bobby Wonderful, An Imperfect Son Buries His Parents. The New York Times Book Review says Morris manages to convey the poignancy of coping with a dying parent while infusing the text with sly humor. The book will move anyone who has had to say goodbye to a loved one, especially those who have felt unequal to the task. This is tough subject matter for anyone. Imagine if the most painful and poignant moments of your life were the raw materials you used to make your art. How fine a line would you be walking with members of your family? And imagine if these poignant moments all had to do with people you had been trying to distance yourself from your entire life. I asked Bob how he got the title for his book.
My mother's last word was Bobby. At least it was the last word I could hear her because she was really babbling, but I heard her say my name when I walked into the hospital. But my father wanted to go. He wanted to die for a year, and we basically sentenced him to life to get through granddaughter's bas mitzvah, and it just wasn't convenient. Tried to do the research on how to do him in to help him out the door, but I just it didn't happen. I was afraid, and so he muddled through, but at the end, when he finally was in the ICU and his heart did have a pump in it to keep him going, we all discussed that, he'll have a nice morphine drip and, that'll be the end. I guess it's a pretty medical situation when you pull the pump out of somebody's. Anyway, we were out of the room, but the nurse grabbed us as we came back, and she said, "It was so extraordinary when we pulled the pump. Your father's hand shot up into the air, and he shouted, 'Wonderful.'" So Bobby Wonderful, two words that the last words I heard these people say who raised me and who were in my life every second. And they still are.
I've known Bob since we were in our 20s, and we were funding our experimental theater trip to Italy by working in a very odd job that summer. We somehow ended up manning a Frank Perdue promotional chicken hot dog we were at the base of the World Trade Center when it still existed, trying to sell Perdue's chicken hot dogs for 25 cents, and the line was around the block, and you seized that moment. You said, "We're going to sing show tunes."
No.
Oh, yes, you did. I would say there sometimes were 50 or 100 people online for these 25-cent hot dogs.
And we were serving these dogs and singing while we were working?
Yes, well, the problem was we would run out of dogs. Bob really wanted to be a showman, and he has some wonderful off-Broadway plays and performances to his credit. But he really hit his stride when he turned to journalism and managed to get a regular column in the New York Times. The curious thing was that Bob's best subject matter turned out to be his parents, a fact that surprises him to this day. His first book, Assisted Loving, True Tales of Double Dating with My Dad, was a hilarious look at the contentious, funny, and loving relationship Bob had with his aging and newly widowed father, who wanted to start internet dating in the year following his wife's death and enlisted his gay son to help him find the right woman. I asked Bob about what his father made of the project and whether he was proud of his son.
He tried to sue me or threaten me for the original title, then wrote me a check saying, if you just will change the title, here's a check, because it was called Pimping for My Father. It was my idea, and I loved it because it was young and had some humor. So the effect of his being proud of me, it was more that out of him came somebody who was a published columnist in the New York Times for 10 years. And I don't know if I mentioned in Bobby Wonderful, but in the other book, you know, he's often going around with clippings of my articles in his wallet. And in the trunk of his car that I sold when he died, you know, there were dozens of magazines that I wrote for with articles from 1995. George magazine, Vogue magazine, Elle. I mean, there was also 8,000 filthy tennis balls and 20 x-rays that he never, you know, from his heart doctor. And there was a Trojan in his glove compartment.
As much as Bob loved his parents, he never really felt like he belonged. In fact, he knew he was meant for better things. He was trying to get out of Bayshore, Long Island since he was a kid, fantasizing about the lifestyle in the Hamptons and contrasting it unfavorably with his middle-class Middle Island origins.
My father was standing in the cemetery where my mother was buried, you know, and he said, just so you know, there's a plot for you here. I looked around and I heard the Southern State Parkway nearby, and it was near like a kind of an industrial strip outside of the gates of the cemetery. And the cemetery was like not very old. Nothing, for example, like the beautiful cemetery in Springs where Frank O'Hara is buried and Stan Vanderbeek, you know, and probably Elaine de Kooning, I think. I was a very aspirational son. And so maybe I wasn't proud of my parents either. You know, this cemetery is called Mount Ararat Cemetery. It's part of this whole conglomeration of cemeteries. And I looked around and I said, Dad, you know, it's really nice offer, but I don't know how to say this, but I don't like this cemetery. And he said, why? And I said, well, it's the South Shore of Long Island. He said, well, that's where you're from. And I said, I know. It's just I never really cared for it. And he said, it must be tough not liking where you came from. Look, this sounds really petty. He said, well, the South Shore of Long Island, I mean, you like the Hamptons, that's the South Shore of Long Island. And I said, no, Dad, that's the East End of Long Island. It's a very different thing.
That's right.
I'm not very far. I can always wander to someone up yonder that's just as sweet as angels are. Just halfway to heaven, you'll find a cottage small.
I think if there's something to be said for the life of people in a quiet suburb that's not all that architecturally distinguished and beautiful. I mean, it did have a good library, but the idea that they were at home there and comfortable there is always underneath like what I'm writing about. You know, I'm kind of more the voice of a generation of kids who were raised post-war by parents who were children in the Depression. They fought, you know, the men fought in wars. They wanted to come home and start a life, and not all of them were so ambitious. You know, there are entire tracts of Long Island devoted, you know, starting with Levittown, devoted people for whom that was the American dream. And I think that was my parents. You know, there's a scene in my book of me playing trombone in the Sag Harbor Community Band with my parents. My parents loved that. And so that was the combination of that they were nearby, they were 45 minutes away, and they could come, and I was doing this thing that they raised me to do. So I'm talking about in my early 40s, when I was living in the Hamptons in the summer, Single and out of sorts, my parents would drive out each Tuesday night from their unglamorous suburb to hear me play trombone with the Sag Harbor Community Band. I never knew what to do with them when they'd visit. I didn't want to scare them with the prices at expensive restaurants or introduce them to the few friends I had. They didn't fit the upscale image I wanted to convey. Of course, I was angry with myself for feeling this way, a grown man with the status issues of a teenager. But with the band, we found common ground. At our first concert of the summer of 2001, I watched them arrive from behind my music stand. I was nervous, but did pretty well with some enchanted evening. The real enchantment of the evening came later, when we played New York, New York. At some point, I looked up at the crowd, and there, under a rising half-moon, my parents were dancing, holding each other close against the winds of change that was aging them so quickly. It threw me back to when they were a handsome young couple, and I would sit on the stairs in my pajamas and look at them in the living room, dancing to cha-cha records late at night. How could they have ever been so young? And how could they get so old before my eyes? We were playing Getting to Know You, and my father was standing up and singing. And as I strained to play for them, just as I had at all those school concerts, I could see that our music was making them young again, and it was doing the same for me. The sunset faded. The stars came out above Sag Harbor's marina, with masts ringing in the summer wind.
Beautiful.
I'm trying to, find the voice of everybody in my and our age group, in our bracket. Everybody who was lucky enough to be raised well and easily and have tuition paid for and all, and to still find reasons for conflict. So as much as I may have admired the style of Hamptonite people who had second homes in the Hamptons and homes on Park Avenue, it turned out that a lot of these parents were kind of problematic people. And I don't mean criminals, but I just mean mothers who were so self-absorbed with their image and on pills, weren't very present, and you couldn't really sit at their kitchen table.
But you were learning this early, or it took you some time to learn?
No, it took me until, I regret to say, till I was in my 40s.
Yeah.
Which is when I wrote the first book.
Yeah.
I'm the ukulele man. Come and listen if you can. The children love to hear me play. They even make their mother stay and stand and listen all the day to the ukulele man.
This past summer, Bob gave a reading and performance of Bobby Wonderful at a bookstore in East Hampton. Here's one of my favorite scenes from the book.
When I go out with my little blank case, the strangest things occur.
Visiting hours are over when I walk into North Shore Hospital and ride up in an elevator. I'm scared. What will my father look like? Will he be able to talk? Will I be able to thank him for everything and apologize for being so critical of him? I panic when I don't see him in a bed. I'm too late, I think. It's over. He's gone, and I never said goodbye. Then I see something opposite the bed. Legs. His legs, and at the end of them, his Velcro-strapped gray vinyl sneakers. He's sitting on the far end of the pale yellow room, straight up in his wheelchair. Clear oxygen tubes are in his nose attached to a portable tank of little wheels. He's listening on his cell phone, and he's grimacing, and then he erupts. No, the issue is not the service, it's the amount of peak minutes, he bellows. He looks up to see me and waves me inside. I have serious health issues, and this is very aggravating, he barks. Well, I guess he's not dying. In fact, the opposite. And lately, he's been contending that a good argument makes him feel better. I'm not too old to switch my service, he threatens. And then he smiles. That's great. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I hardly know what to think. Bobby, delighted to see you. I'm just thrilled, he says. Same here, I say. I was worried you were dying. False alarm, he says, and he turns up a Mets game on TV. I'm not even close. Well, so what to do now? Even at the end when it might finally be time to relent and give the man what he wanted his whole life, a son who watches sports with him on TV, I refuse. And I have to say, I'm a little disappointed not to have had the end-of-life conversation I so frantically scripted on my drive. The one that so many spiritually obsessed boomers think is essential, even when the dying find it unnecessary and intimidating. I want to squeeze some meaning out of this visit to lift it above the rest, make it something between transitional and redemptive. Let's go, Dad, I say, grabbing hold of the oxygen tank. Now, as much as I never wanted him in a wheelchair, there's something almost enjoyable about the control over him he gives me. And with a lurch, I push him out of his room and into the bright and empty hallway. We get to a small lounge where a big flat screen TV plays in the dark. I turn it off, but I don't turn on any lights. I lock the brakes on my father's wheelchair and sit down on a sofa and face him. So, Dad, I was thinking about you. Always nice to hear that, he says. Have you been thinking about yourself? I don't know what you mean. And then we go silent. I scan my head for ideas, and then I see the headline of the USA Today on a coffee table. Well, the war in Iraq isn't going so well, is it? I say. Do you think the end of life is a time to take stock and reconsider things? He tilts his head and looks at me and then sighs. That's what they say, but I haven't given it much thought, he replies. Well, I have a proposal, I say. Why? Because I was hoping you'd think it's time for a gesture of redemption. What's your proposal? I would like you to renounce the Republican Party. My father stays still. Then the hint of a smirk moves onto his face. You've got to be kidding, he says. No, I almost got into an accident speeding down here on a holiday weekend because I thought you were dying. Sorry I disappointed you, he says. I want to get my money's worth out of this trip, Dad. Well, you should know it means the world to me that you're here. You don't have to put anything in writing, I say. I'm just asking you to tell me if you regret being such a staunch Republican your whole life. When he breathes out, it is so loud and long that it's as if his soul is leaving him. You were always pushing me, Bobby, trying to get me to see things your way. Why bother? Dad, I am just trying to seize the moment here. You really don't think I'm going to live much longer? I just want to ask, even if it's a little premature, will you consider, if only for me, renouncing the Republican Party? It could be an act of some kind of personal redemption. I am blushing now at my nerve and at my will. I could say that I am sorry I voted for the present George Bush, he says. As soon as he says it, I feel light pour into my brain and see angels reflected on his aviator glasses circling the ceiling. My heart races, but I don't say a word, I just let it sink in. Well done, sir, I say. Thank you very much. Well, you pushed me into it. What could I do? But you're in your right mind, and you mean it. Yes, I'm afraid I do. I would not vote for this George Bush again. I feel triumphant as I lean into him and feel his chest heaving against mine. Can I give you a hug? His eyebrows lift. He smiles. He's always up for any kind of affection. Sure. I put my arms around his neck and, very careful to avoid the oxygen tubes, lean into his face, my big nose to his bigger one, and we hold ourselves there like teenagers in a slow dance. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Bobby. And then I get up, unlock his wheels, turn his chair around, find a remote control, turn the Mets game volume all the way up, and settle in to watch with him for the rest of the night. He takes my hand. We hold on to each other in the glow of the TV screen. This book is surprising me because it's a tough topic. It is selling very slowly, but there isn't a day when a stranger doesn't track me down by email
Wow.
to spill their guts
Wow.
and to thank me. And usually the thanks have to do with giving them some permission.
Mm-hmm.
That's usually what it is. I mean, one of my favorite compliments came from the librarian where I live now in Bellport. It's a big library. I don't know any of the librarians. I'm always in there, printing 150-page documents, which I'm sure is a pain in the neck, but it's a big library. It's a fantastic county library. I was checking out actually 50 Shades of Grey as a DVD. And so I particularly didn't want to have anybody paying attention.
That's correct.
And she said, I loved your book. And she said, gosh, I hope I'm not embarrassing you. And I said, are you kidding? Are you kidding? To hear from a librarian who didn't know me from anybody? This is what you want.
Mm-hmm. Bob says he thinks Bobby Wonderful is a religious book, and the goal of it is to give others who may be going through something similar permission to take care of themselves. He said in a Huffington Post article, I was pretty keen on not letting the devastating years of my parents' illnesses completely take me down.
You ask me why I cry, pretending that you don't know, but dear, you do.
The wrestling match is definitely me against myself, and also me and my brother, but struggling to not defend myself exactly, but to justify and rationalize selfishness.
Because I think to people who aren't artists, it often looks like what we're doing is selfishness.
Sure. Taking advantage of privacy in situations. I mean, I can tell you that my brother was furious, even though most people read it and see him as heroic for being so protective of my mother's welfare and such a, strong, good son. But I think I probably make being the wicked son, the less responsible son, very charming and appealing. I mean, that in certain cultures, remote cultures don't want their picture taken. You know that.
Yeah.
And you know what they say, right? They think that you're stealing their soul.
That's right.
I think that there is that, to be an observer, so emotional and trying to remember it detaches you from living it fully. There's a tremendous history of writers doing that. The most famous line that you've probably heard about this is Nora Ephron's mother. Phoebe Ephron was a screenwriter. And when the mother was dying in the hospital, she said, why aren't you taking notes? I think when people get upset with writers, especially if you're writing about them, is that it's in my hands. So this truth and this reality of writing about the death of my parents, which when it happens, it doesn't matter that it's happened to everybody. It's especially if you are not involved in giving birth to children. When you see your parents go, it's primal. And so while I was living it, I promise you I wasn't taking notes or thinking of writing a book. It wasn't on my mind. It was not.
No kidding.
No. And so the process is much more, for me, years later, it's when there are things that I can't forget and things that I wish I had done differently and things that I want to revisit, this ache. And so I'm writing from either an ache or a moment of such profound hilarity and absurdity, My asking a nurse on my mother's floor, why has my mother been delirious and yabbering and caterwauling for a week? What's happening? Like she seems so lively. What is going on? Like we just thought we had to fix something. And the nurse said to me, well, it's often what we see at the end. And so when I went to my brother and I said that, to the doctors and my brother, and I said, look, the nurse is saying that it may be time to have comfort care to help her out, gracefully with the morphine drip. You know, the doctors didn't say anything, but my brother said, why? Because it's convenient for you.
In another quote, Bob says he thinks there's a spirituality in happiness. One of the most profoundly happy things that I would do with my dad was sing with him. I got hold of a lot of good sheet music and would play in the lobby of the assisted living home where he lived. Instead of speaking, sometimes we'd just sing.
I wrote a column for the Times about 10 years ago or more. My mom's been gone longer. When she was at the end, she was very sick. And you get the idea now that I'm a person that cares way too much about appearances, aspirational. And I wanted her to dress better to hide her emaciated frame. Because she was in Palm Beach for the winter. And she was wearing like T-shirts and sweatshirts. And I said, look, let me take you to the mall. I have the idea that if you were to wear collared, short sleeve shirts, it'd look better than T-shirts. And she said, no, I don't want to go. Anyway, I talked her into it. And of course, I did what I always did with my parents, was that I made everything into a lark, So we went driving to this mall, and I'm sure I was singing or playing music that she liked. And then, walking so slowly, to the women's department at Macy's. And we tried on hats because she was losing her hair. And I found these shirts, and I'm sure the women in the sales department thought I was out of my mind, like just a bossy stylist from New York or something, bossing this frail, sweet lady around. But we got home, and we got back to the apartment, and, she was trying things on. I'd say either in this book or the last book that it was like better for her than all the pills in her medicine cabinet to look good and to have my attention and my compliments. And anyway, I wrote it up in the Times, in my column, and her friends called her up and they said, you must be so embarrassed, like to be portrayed emaciated like that, and like to now know the public all knows how unwell you are, and blah blah blah. My mother said, no, everything he said was true. And that just blows me away, because that's what you want.
Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger. You may see a stranger across a crowded room.
It's one thing to get that from your mother, and it's profound. It's another thing to get it from strangers, but the truth, what is the truth? And then and how does a writer pick those moments and those exchanges and those details that not just tell the story, but then tell readers who have their own families and their own mishigas and the truth of what their life is. I mean, that's what you're going for. People, they talk about, when somebody says to me, you write so beautifully, I don't know what to think, because I think maybe what they're trying to say is that I'm thinking in a way that they find elevating or beautiful or something. Thinking beautifully. Like what is beautiful writing? It's really, I think, thinking and seeing. Like you said, you see things semiotically and all, but I think that's true. There's
such a sweetness. There's such a brutal honesty, and yet there's no cliches. This is a very hard balance to get. You don't overdo it. You don't wring it out. You've got a really beautiful way of telling these deep stories with great humor and grace. You sense what's too much and what's not enough. You're saying just enough
okay
to paint this picture.
Okay,
and
touche.
And to leave room for the reader. And I
Okay.
think you do that
Okay,
beautifully.
thank you.
Did you think you'd be a writer when you were studying semiotics?
No, I didn't think I'd write books. I wanted to do theater.
You did.
Yeah. And it just didn't work out that way. And journalism was a way to get at some of it.
Mm-hmm. Did you envision that you would be writing so much about them?
No.
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 So
And I'm definitely onto other things now.
Okay.
You know, marriage, the addiction of marriage.
Yes, and how does Ira feel about having the
It's
spotlight
very
on him?
complicated. In this case, I'm trying to engage him in the project by having him read a chapter and write me a letter. And then we'll
Wow.
decide if it's a letter and then from there we have a conversation.
Oh,
and
this is a collaboration.
You know, I have to be driving the bus.
Yeah.
But I think because it is going to be about something very private and there's a lot of really serious conflict going on, that I want him to feel he owns it, not just monetarily, but ideologically.
This
So
sounds
we'll
so
see.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Cannot wait.
So-
Bob's friend and author writes of Bobby Wonderful, quote, "With humor and unflinching honesty, Bob Morris confronts the deterioration and death of his parents. His anger, impatience, tenderness, and love light each page. He is right about so much, including how wrong we get it. This is our common experience. We fumble and stumble to express our love without going mad, doing the best we can."
Regrets are as regular as breaths. They tell us we're alive. When my father's at the end, a rabbi visits at his hospital bed and tells him, there's a spot of light inside each of us when we're born, and it's a little bit of God. It grows as you become a good son, neighbor, and husband, and parent, and it grows each time you do a good deed, each time you listen with an open heart. Imagine your whole life now, the rabbi continues, and for each time you did something good, imagine it as a little glow you left behind that lights a long dark road stretching back in time. My father nods, and through my tears I see his spots of light glowing pearly as if in a mist of years as they trail off into the dark. Yes, I think. My father has his flaws, but he has done the best he can for an entire lifetime. Like all of us, the best we can.
You ask me why I cry, pretending that you don't know. But dear, you do. Just like a happy day that's ending, our sweet romance is ending too. I'm crying 'cause I know I'm losing you. I'm sighing 'cause I know I'm losing you. Though you say no and smile at me, it's just a smile of sympathy. I've tried to make you happy, honest, true. Instead, somehow I know I made you blue. My heart is aching.